Hey guys! Tonight we dive into the surprisingly complex world of Viking marriages where romance took a back seat to politics, alliances, and the raw pursuit of power. From strategic matchmaking that could unite warring clans to wedding ceremonies that doubled as peace treaties, Viking unions were far more calculated than any fairy tale would have you believe. These weren't just about love, they were about survival, status, and securing your family's future in a world where a single wrong alliance could mean the difference between prosperity and obliteration. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Viking weddings, you might picture passionate warriors sweeping their beloved off their feet in dramatic romantic gestures, but the reality was far more pragmatic and, frankly, ruthless. Viking marriages were chess moves on a board, where kingdoms, trade routes, and family honor were the prizes. Love might bloom eventually, but it was never the starting point. These unions were forged in the fires of necessity, shaped by the iron will of ambitious parents, and sealed with dowries that could fund entire armies. Tonight, we'll uncover how Viking couples navigated a world where your wedding day wasn't about finding your soulmate, was about finding your family's political salvation. If you think online dating is brutal, spare a thought for Viking daughters, who were essentially listed on the medieval equivalent of a livestock exchange before they could even spell their own names. In the unforgiving world of 9th century Scandinavia, a girl's romantic future wasn't determined by compatibility questionnaires or shared interests in long walks on fjord beaches. Instead, it was decided by hard-nosed negotiations between fathers who viewed their daughters with the same calculating eyes they used to appraise cattle, trade goods, and potential farmland. Love had nothing to do with it. This was business, and business was brutal. The Viking marriage market operated on a simple, merciless principle. Daughters were investments that paid dividends in political power, military alliances, and cold, hard silver. From the moment a girl drew her first breath, her father was already mentally tallying her potential worth on the marriage exchange. Would she be beautiful enough to catch the eye of a powerful Jarl? Would her family connections make her attractive to ambitious clan leaders? Could her dowry sweeten a deal that might end a blood feud or secure trading rights to a lucrative route? These weren't questions for her teenage years. These were calculations that began in the cradle and intensified with every passing season. Viking society was built on a foundation of interconnected families, each one clawing for advantage in a world where winter could kill you, raiders could burn your farm, and political miscalculations could see your entire bloodline wiped from the earth. In such a harsh environment, marriage wasn't a personal choice, it was a survival strategy. A well-placed daughter could mean the difference between your family thriving for generations or disappearing into the footnotes of saga literature. And if that daughter happened to have personal preferences about her future husband, well, those preferences ranked somewhere below the family dog's opinion on foreign policy. The process began early, often absurdly so. Viking fathers, with any ambition at all, were sizing up potential matches for their daughters before the girls had lost their baby teeth. Picture the scene: a 7-year-old girl, innocently playing with carved wooden dolls, while her father entertained visiting chieftains, and behind the mead horns and friendly conversation, deals were already being tentatively discussed. Beautiful child you have there, Eric. That red hair will serve her well. What seemed like polite small talk was actually the opening move in negotiations that could span decades. By the time a girl reached her early teens, the serious matchmaking began in earnest. This wasn't the gentle, hopeful process modern parents might engage in when wondering if their daughter will find someone nice. This was strategic warfare conducted with the precision of a military campaign. Fathers consulted with trusted advisors, weighed the political landscape, assessed the strength of various clans, and calculated potential returns on investment. They maintained mental databases of eligible sons, tracking their bloodlines, their father's wealth, their military prowess, and their potential to inherit significant holdings. The criteria for an ideal match had absolutely nothing to do with whether the young people might actually enjoy each other's company. Instead, Viking fathers evaluated suitors based on a cold checklist of practical considerations. Did the boy's family control important trade routes? Were they allied with powerful jarls who could provide military support? Did they have a reputation for honor, meaning they could be trusted to uphold their end of complex bargains? Was their farmland fertile and well-positioned? Did they have the political connections necessary to advance your family's interests? The groom's personality, his treatment of women, his sense of humor, his kindness, these were irrelevant details that didn't factor into the equation. What made a daughter valuable in this mercenary marketplace was a combination of factors that would make modern parents deeply uncomfortable. Physical beauty certainly mattered, but not for romantic reasons. A beautiful daughter attracted more suitors, which meant better negotiating positions and higher potential bride prices. She was essentially a luxury item that commanded premium rates. But beauty alone wasn't enough. It had to be paired with the right bloodline, the right family connections, and the right dowry package. Family reputation carried enormous weight in these calculations. A daughter from a respected clan, one known for producing strong warriors, clever traders, or influential leaders, was worth significantly more than a girl from a family of farmers or craftsmen. Regardless of her personal qualities, Viking society was intensely hierarchical, and marrying into a prestigious bloodline was like purchasing stock in a successful company. You weren't just getting a wife, you were buying access to an entire network of powerful relatives who could advance your interests for generations. The dowry negotiations were where these transactions became truly ruthless. A dowry wasn't a generous gift from loving parents. It was a carefully calculated investment designed to secure the best possible return. Fathers would liquidate assets, sell land, trade livestock, and even borrow money to assemble dowry packages that would make their daughters irresistible to high-value suitors. The dowry might include silver, jewelry, weapons, household goods, livestock, land rights, and even promises of future military support. It was essentially a bribe, but an expected and necessary one. The bride price, paid by the groom's family to the bride's parents, added another layer of complexity to these negotiations. This wasn't compensation for raising the daughter, it was the purchase price for acquiring her reproductive potential and the political alliance that came with her. The higher the bride price, the more valuable the daughter was considered. Families would boast about the bride prices. Their daughters commanded the same way modern parents might brag about their children's college acceptances. It was a mark of prestige, a public validation of your family's worth. The negotiation process itself was a delicate dance of diplomacy, threats, and economic maneuvering that could stretch on for months or even years. Fathers didn't simply announce their asking prices and wait for offers. Instead, they engaged in elaborate games of positioning, gathering intelligence about potential suitors' financial situations, spreading subtle rumors about their daughter's desirability, and carefully timing their approaches to maximize their bargaining power. It was like playing chess, poker, and running a marketing campaign all at the same time. These negotiations often took place during major gatherings, seasonal markets, religious festivals, or political assemblies where multiple families converged. Picture the scene: dozens of Viking fathers circulating through crowds of potential in-laws, their daughters displayed like prized possessions, conversations flowing between casual pleasantries and deadly serious discussions of terms. Mothers, meanwhile, would carefully position their daughters for maximum visual impact, coaching them on how to stand, how to speak when addressed, and how to project the kind of quiet competence that suggested they would run households efficiently and produce healthy heirs. The daughters themselves were largely spectators in these proceedings, expected to remain silent, attractive, and compliant, while their futures were bartered away. They might be presented to potential suitors like livestock at auction, asked to demonstrate domestic skills, or questioned about their health and fertility prospects. Their opinions about the arrangements were neither sought nor welcomed. If they were lucky, they might overhear fragments of the negotiations that would determine the rest of their lives. If they were unlucky, they would discover their fates only when their fathers announced the completed deals. The complexity of these arrangements often required formal contracts that outline not just the immediate terms of the marriage, but also contingencies for various scenarios. What happened if the daughter died in childbirth before producing an heir? What if the groom's family failed to meet their financial obligations? What if political circumstances changed and the alliance became disadvantageous? Viking marriage contracts were essentially international treaties, dressed up as romantic commitments, complete with escape clauses, penalty provisions, and detailed specifications about mutual obligations. The role of intermediaries in these negotiations cannot be overstated. Wealthy families often employed professional matchmakers, usually older women with extensive networks and reputations for discretion, who could navigate the complex social and political landscape of potential marriages. These women were part diplomat, part intelligence agent, and part saleswoman. They maintained detailed knowledge of eligible young people across multiple regions, tracked the financial situations of prominent families, and possessed the social skills necessary to broker deals between parties who might otherwise view each other with suspicion or hostility. Some of the most successful matchmakers were widows from prominent families who had maintained their deceased husband's political connections while gaining the independence to operate in their own right. These women understood better than anyone how the marriage market really functioned, having experienced firsthand how personal desires were subordinated to family interests. They were particularly valuable because they could speak candidly with other women about sensitive topics: fertility prospects, family histories of madness or weakness, hidden debts, or political entanglements that might make certain matches inadvisable. The seasonal nature of Viking life added another layer of complexity to marriage negotiations. Fathers had to time their approaches carefully, considering agricultural cycles, raiding seasons, and political developments. A family that had just returned from a successful trading expedition might be in a generous mood and willing to pay higher bride prices. A clan that had suffered military defeats or poor harvests might be desperate to form protective alliances and willing to accept less favorable terms. Savvy negotiators learned to read these economic and political currents, timing their proposals to coincide with moments of maximum advantage. Geographic considerations played a crucial role in determining marriage values. Daughters from families who controlled strategic location spots, river crossings, mountain passes, or fertile valleys commanded premium prices, because marrying them meant gaining access to important trade routes or defensive positions. A girl whose father owned land adjacent to a major trading center might be worth significantly more than one from an isolated farmstead, regardless of their personal qualities. Location wasn't just a real estate principle, it was a marriage market fundamental. The practice of strategic marriages often involved moving daughters considerable distances from their birth families, essentially exporting them to regions where their family connections would be most valuable. A daughter might be sent hundreds of miles away to cement an alliance with a distant clan, knowing she would likely never see her parents again. These long-distance marriages were particularly challenging because the daughters had to adapt not only to new husbands and families, but also to different dialects, customs, and political situations. They were cultural ambassadors, as much as wives, expected to represent their birth family's interests while integrating into their new communities. The competition between families to secure the best matches for their daughters could become incredibly intense, sometimes escalating into feuds that lasted generations. Fathers who felt their daughters had been unfairly passed over, or who believed they had been cheated in negotiations, might harbor resentments that influenced their future dealings with other families. These matrimonial politics created complex webs of alliance and enmity that shaped regional power structures. A daughter's successful marriage could elevate her entire extended family's status, while a failed negotiation could damage relationships across multiple clans. The economic calculations involved in these marriage transactions were staggering. Families would literally mortgage their futures to fund impressive dowries, believing that the political and social returns would justify the immediate financial sacrifice. This created a kind of arms race, where dowries grew increasingly elaborate as families competed to outbid each other for the most desirable matches. Some families bankrupted themselves in pursuit of marriages that would elevate their social standing, gambling everything on the hope that their daughters' unions would open doors to greater prosperity. The pressure on daughters to justify these investments was immense. Once married, they were expected not only to manage households efficiently and produce healthy heirs, but also to maintain and strengthen the political alliances their marriages had created. A daughter who failed to integrate successfully into her new family, who proved barren, or who somehow damaged the relationship between the clans, could bring shame and financial loss to everyone involved in her marriage negotiations. The weight of these expectations often shaped every aspect of their adult lives. Perhaps most remarkably, this entire system operated with a veneer of social respectability that made the underlying transactions appear natural and proper. Viking culture had developed elaborate rituals, customs, and social codes that dressed up what were essentially slave auctions in the language of honor, tradition, and family duty. Daughters were taught from childhood to take pride in their market value, to view themselves as precious assets whose proper deployment could benefit entire extended families. The most successful daughters in this system were those who learned to navigate their roles as both people and property with grace and strategic intelligence. If you think modern dating apps have reduced romance to a series of calculated judgments based on superficial criteria, the Viking marriage market would have made your swiping habits look like pure sentiment. In a world where survival often depended on making smart alliances and poor choices could doom entire bloodlines, love was a luxury that few families could afford. Daughters learned early that their personal happiness was secondary to their strategic value, and that their worth would be measured not by their individual achievements or character, but by how effectively they could be deployed in the endless game of family advancement. It was a system that produced strong political alliances and stable economic relationships, but it came at the cost of treating half the population as negotiable assets in a marketplace where only the men held the currency. If you've ever sat through a modern wedding ceremony, wondering when the couple will get to the part where they actually promise to merge their investment portfolios and coordinate their career advancement strategies, you would have appreciated Viking weddings. These weren't romantic celebrations disguised as business transactions. They were business transactions that didn't bother with the romantic disguise. Every ritual, every symbolic gesture, every carefully choreographed moment was designed to broadcast political messages to anyone within a 100-mile radius. Love might make an appearance at some point during the festivities, but it would have to wait its turn behind more pressing concerns like territorial agreements, trade negotiations, and the formal transfer of human assets. A Viking wedding wasn't a party. It was a summit meeting with better catering and more swords. The ceremony itself was essentially an elaborate piece of political theatre where every participant knew their role, every gesture carried weight, and every detail had been negotiated in advance by people who understood that a poorly executed wedding could spark blood feuds lasting generations. If you think planning a modern wedding is stressful because you can't decide between salmon and chicken for the reception dinner, imagine trying to coordinate a ceremony where the wrong symbolic gesture could accidentally declare war on your new in-laws. The preparations for a Viking wedding began months in advance, not because the bride needed time to find the perfect dress, but because the families needed time to orchestrate what was essentially a diplomatic conference disguised as a celebration. Both sides would spend weeks coordinating the guest list, which wasn't about who would be fun at the party, but about who needed to witness the alliance and whose presence would send the appropriate political messages. Inviting the wrong chieftain could insult his rival. Failing to invite someone with influence could create future enemies. The wedding planning committee was less concerned with floral arrangements and more focused on preventing accidental diplomatic incidents. The location itself was chosen for strategic rather than aesthetic reasons. While modern couples might select venues based on scenic beauty or sentimental value, Viking families picked spots that could accommodate large crowds of armed guests without creating security nightmares. Often, weddings were held at major trading centers, religious sites, or the halls of powerful Jarls places where the ceremony would have maximum visibility and political impact. The goal wasn't to create a romantic atmosphere. It was to ensure that news of the alliance would spread quickly across the region and reach the ears of anyone who might need to adjust their own political calculations accordingly. The timing of Viking weddings followed practical rather than romantic considerations. Summer was preferred, not because of better weather for outdoor photography, but because travel was easier and food was more abundant. Families could gather their scattered relatives, allies could make the journey without risking winter storms, and there was less chance of the festivities being interrupted by raiding season. The bride and groom had about as much input into their wedding date as they did into the stock market. It was determined by factors entirely beyond their control. The ceremony itself began with rituals that would have made a modern wedding planner break out in cold sweats. The exchange of swords, one of the most important Viking wedding traditions, had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with political symbolism. The groom would present an ancestral sword to the bride's family, symbolically demonstrating his worthiness and the strength of his bloodline. In return, the bride's family would give him a sword from their own armory, marking his acceptance into their clan. These weren't decorative pieces. They were functional weapons with histories, and their exchange represented a formal military alliance between the families. The bride's job during this ceremony was to stand quietly and look appropriately solemn, while weapons that could end lives were traded over her head like poker chips. The religious elements of the ceremony invoked the Norse gods not for blessings on love and happiness, but for divine sanction of political agreements. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, featured prominently in the proceedings, with ritual hammers placed on the bride's lap to invoke the god's protection for fertility and prosperity. This wasn't about spiritual connection, it was about supernatural insurance policies. The gods were being formally notified that a new alliance had been formed and were expected to honor their end of the cosmic bargain by providing military success, good harvests, and healthy heirs. Animal sacrifices were a standard part of Viking wedding ceremonies, but not for the reasons you might expect. The slaughter of horses, cattle, or other valuable livestock served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the family's wealth, provided meat for the wedding feast, and created a blood offering to seal the divine aspects of the contract. The sacrifice was conducted with elaborate ritual precision, and the meat was distributed according to strict protocols that reinforced social hierarchies and political relationships. Even the wedding barbecue was a carefully orchestrated political statement. The wedding feast that followed the ceremony was where the real business of the alliance took place. While the bride and groom sat at the head table looking appropriately matrimonial, their fathers and other family leaders conducted what amounted to a working dinner, focused on hammering out the practical details of their new relationship. Trade agreements were finalized, territorial boundaries were clarified, and future military cooperation was planned. The seating arrangements alone required diplomatic skills worthy of a United Nations summit, with careful attention paid to hierarchy, alliances, and potential conflicts among the guests. The role of witnesses at Viking weddings was far more significant than their modern counterparts, who mostly just watch the ceremony and eat cake. Viking witnesses were essentially signing their names to an international treaty. Their presence made the marriage legally binding and politically enforceable, and they could be called upon, in future disputes, to testify about the terms that had been agreed upon. Being invited to witness a Viking wedding wasn't just an honor, it was a legal responsibility that could drag you into conflicts for years to come. These witnesses had to be chosen carefully, balancing the need for respectable, reliable people against the desire to include individuals whose presence would add political weight to the proceedings. The bride's transition from her father's authority to her husband's was marked by rituals that made the property transfer explicit and irrevocable. Her father would formally hand over her dowry, which was less a generous gift than a carefully calculated investment portfolio designed to give the new couple the resources they needed to fulfill their side of the family alliance. The dowry wasn't given to the bride, it was transferred to her husband's control, along with the bride herself. She was essentially a valuable bonus that came with the economic package, a human asset whose reproductive potential and family connections were now available to advance her husband's interests. The exchange of rings, if it occurred at all, was less about romantic symbolism than about legal documentation. Wedding rings served as receipts for completed transactions, visible proof that the bride had been formally transferred and the dowry had been paid. They were often engraved with runic symbols that identified the families involved and the date of the transaction, functioning as portable legal documents in a society where written contracts were rare and disputes were settled through personal testimony. The wedding crowns worn by Viking brides and grooms were not symbols of love, but of authority and status. These elaborate headdresses, often family heirlooms passed down through generations, announced the social standing of the participants and the importance of the alliance being celebrated. The more ornate the crowns, the more prestigious the families, and the more significant the political implications of their union. Guests could read the ceremony like a stock ticker, interpreting the symbolic language to understand exactly what kind of power shift was taking place. The ceremonial drinking from shared horns was another ritual loaded with political meaning. The mead or ale consumed wasn't just refreshment, it was a communion that bound the participants to their agreements. The drink was often blessed by priests or shamans, and sharing it created spiritual as well as legal obligations. The bride and groom weren't toasting their love, they were sealing a contract that would govern their behavior and their families' relationships for generations to come. Poetry played a crucial role in Viking wedding ceremonies, but not the kind of romantic verse you might expect. Skalds, professional poets, who served as combination entertainers and historians, would compose elaborate verses commemorating the alliance and praising the political wisdom of the families involved. These poems weren't just entertainment, they were oral contracts, preserving the terms of the agreement in memorable form and ensuring that future generations would understand the obligations created by the marriage. The bride and groom were often barely mentioned in these compositions, which focused instead on the strategic brilliance of their parents and the benefits the alliance would bring to both clans. The wedding games and competitions that enlivened the festivities were designed to demonstrate the military prowess and economic resources of the allied families. Contests of strength, skill with weapons, and horsemanship weren't just fun diversions. They were job interviews, where young men from both sides could display their qualifications for future military service or trading expeditions. The winners gained reputation and status, while the losers learned exactly where they stood in the new power structure created by the marriage alliance. Gift-giving at Viking weddings followed elaborate protocols that had nothing to do with helping the couple set up housekeeping and everything to do with reinforcing social hierarchies and political relationships. The value and nature of gifts announced the giver's status, their relationship to the families involved, and their expectations for future cooperation. Wealthy allies competed to offer the most impressive presents, while lesser families carefully calculated their offerings to show respect without overextending their resources. Even the wedding presents were political statements. The legal formalities that concluded the ceremony were conducted with the same attention to detail that modern societies reserve for international treaties. Formal contracts were read aloud, witnessed, and often recorded on wooden staves with runic inscriptions. These documents specified not just the terms of the marriage itself, but also the broader alliance between the families, including mutual defense obligations, trading rights, and inheritance arrangements. The bride and groom were often the least important participants in these legal proceedings, which were conducted by their fathers and other male relatives who had the authority to make binding commitments. The morning after the wedding brought the morgengabe, the morning gift that the new husband presented to his bride. This wasn't a romantic gesture, but a legal requirement that formally completed the marriage transaction and provided the wife with some measure of economic security. The size and nature of the morgengabe were usually negotiated in advance as part of the wedding arrangements, and it served as both a receipt for services rendered and an insurance policy against future difficulties. It was the Viking equivalent of a prenuptial agreement, except it was signed after the fact and only benefited one party. The ceremonial bedding of the couple, while it might sound like a private romantic moment, was often a semi-public affair, with witnesses to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. This wasn't about intimacy, it was about legal completion of the contract. The witnesses weren't there for entertainment, but for documentation, and their testimony might be required in future disputes about the validity of the marriage or the legitimacy of any children produced by the union. Privacy was a luxury that Viking newlyweds couldn't afford. The extended celebrations that could last for days or even weeks served multiple practical purposes, beyond giving everyone an excuse to drink mead and tell stories. These gatherings provided opportunities for broader political negotiations, business deals, and social networking that would benefit both families for years to come. Young people could meet potential spouses, warriors could form military bonds, and traders could establish commercial relationships. The wedding feast was essentially a medieval convention center where the ceremony was just the opening keynote address. The departure of the bride from her family home was orchestrated as carefully as a diplomatic summit. Her escort to her new residence wasn't just a ceremonial procession, but a formal transfer of political assets. The composition of the traveling party, the route taken, and the reception at the destination all carried symbolic weight and political significance. The bride wasn't just moving houses, she was being deployed to a new location where she would serve as her birth family's permanent representative and advocate. If you've ever complained about the commercialization of modern weddings, where every detail seems designed to extract maximum profit from desperate couples, you would have been fascinated by Viking ceremonies where every detail was designed to extract maximum political advantage from strategic alliances. There was something almost refreshing about the honesty of it all. No one pretended that the ceremony was about the couple's personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. It was explicitly, unapologetically about power, wealth, and survival in a harsh world where poor alliances could mean extinction and good marriages could secure prosperity for generations. The bride and groom were supporting players in a drama much larger than themselves, and everyone involved understood that their personal feelings were entirely beside the point. At least no one had to pretend otherwise or waste time on the elaborate fiction that love conquered all, when everyone knew that strategic thinking and solid political connections were far more reliable than emotion when it came to building a secure future. If you think negotiating the price of a used car is stressful, imagine trying to determine the exact monetary value of your teenage daughter in a marketplace where the wrong calculation could bankrupt your family or spark a blood feud that would haunt your descendants for generations. Viking marriage negotiations weren't romantic courtships punctuated by gentle discussions of future plans. They were high-stakes, financial poker games where experienced fathers sat across from each other, stone-faced and calculating, trying to extract maximum value while revealing minimum information about their actual resources. These weren't conversations about love and compatibility. They were board meetings conducted in mead halls, where human beings were assessed like real estate and priced according to market conditions that fluctuated based on everything from recent military victories to the quality of last year's harvest. The bride price and dowry system that governed Viking marriages was essentially a dual-currency economy, where families simultaneously bought and sold their way into alliances, creating a complex web of financial obligations that could make modern derivatives trading look straightforward by comparison. Every transaction involved multiple moving parts: the bride price paid by the groom's family to secure the daughter, the dowry provided by the bride's family to sweeten the deal, and a maze of subsidiary payments, gifts, and future financial commitments that could extend for decades after the wedding ceremony. Getting these calculations wrong wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially catastrophic. The bride price, known as munda in Old Norse, was theoretically payment for the bride's family's investment in raising her, but in practice, it functioned more like a luxury tax on desirable bloodlines. The amount wasn't determined by any objective criteria, like years of education or demonstrated domestic skills. Instead, it fluctuated according to market forces that would have made medieval economists weep with confusion. A daughter from a powerful family commanded premium prices, not because she was necessarily more skilled at managing households or producing heirs, but because marrying her meant purchasing access to her relatives' political connections, trade networks, and military resources. She wasn't just a wife, she was a lifetime membership to an exclusive club that happened to raid monasteries and control shipping routes. The negotiation process began months before any formal discussions, with both sides conducting what amounted to financial espionage operations, designed to assess their counterparts' true economic situation. Fathers would dispatch trusted allies to gather intelligence about potential in-laws' livestock holdings, silver reserves, land ownership, and outstanding debts. This wasn't casual curiosity, it was vital market research that would determine negotiating strategies and realistic price ranges. A family that appeared wealthy might actually be leveraged to the hilt from previous dowry payments, while seemingly modest farmers might be sitting on hidden treasure hoards from successful trading expeditions. The actual negotiations were conducted with the formality of international trade agreements and the subtlety of psychological warfare. Both sides understood that appearing too eager could drive prices up, while seeming disinterested might insult the other party and derail discussions entirely. Experienced negotiators developed elaborate strategies for signaling their positions without committing to specific numbers too early in the process. They would praise the quality of each other's daughters, while simultaneously highlighting the challenges involved in any potential union, creating an atmosphere where everyone was simultaneously complimenting and bargaining. The opening gambit usually involved the groom's father making an intentionally low initial offer, not because he expected it to be accepted, but because it established a starting point for the ritualistic haggling that would follow. This first proposal was often accompanied by elaborate justifications about the difficulties of the times, the expenses involved in maintaining a proper household, and the various financial burdens already weighing on his family. The bride's father would respond with expressions of shock and disappointment, countering with demands that were equally unrealistic, but in the opposite direction. Both parties understood they were performing for an audience that included not just each other, but also the various relatives and advisors who would spread word of the negotiations throughout their respective communities. The bride price negotiations were complicated by the fact that payment often involved a combination of silver, livestock, land rights, trade goods, and promises of future considerations that were difficult to value precisely. A groom's family might offer 100 silver arm rings, 20 cattle, fishing rights to a particular stretch of river, and a promise to provide military support during the next raiding season. Calculating the real value of such a package required expertise in multiple areas and the ability to predict future economic conditions. The bride's father had to assess not just the immediate worth of what was being offered, but also the long-term reliability of the family making the promises. Meanwhile, the dowry negotiations were happening in parallel, creating a complex mathematical puzzle where changes in one area affected calculations in another. The dowry, known as Hymenfilge, was supposedly the bride's family's contribution to the new household, but it also functioned as a kind of economic insurance policy and diplomatic sweetener. A generous dowry could compensate for a lower bride price, while a modest dowry might be offset by higher cash payments. The trick was finding the right balance that satisfied both families' financial needs while maintaining appropriate dignity for all parties involved. The composition of dowries was as much about sending political messages as providing practical resources for the new couple. A dowry heavy on silver and jewelry announced the bride's family's wealth and status, while one focused on land and livestock suggested a more substantial, long-term investment in the alliance. Weapons included in the dowry indicated the family's military connections and their expectations about their daughter's future household's defensive needs. Even household goods, like cooking equipment and textiles, carried symbolic weight, demonstrating the family's assessment of their daughter's domestic skills and their confidence in her ability to manage an impressive establishment. The competitive aspect of these financial arrangements often escalated into what could only be described as economic warfare between families vying for the same desirable matches. Word of generous offers spread quickly through Viking communities, forcing other suitors to increase their bids or risk losing out entirely. This created inflationary spirals, where bride prices for particularly attractive daughters could reach astronomical levels that strained even wealthy families' resources. Some fathers found themselves in bidding wars that required them to liquidate assets, borrow money, or mortgage their futures to compete with rivals who seemed determined to win at any cost. The pressure to keep up with escalating dowry standards created similar problems for families with daughters to marry off. As dowries grew more elaborate and expensive, fathers faced the choice between bankrupting themselves to provide competitive packages or accepting that their daughters would have to settle for less prestigious matches. This led to an arms race mentality where families sacrificed long-term financial stability for short-term matrimonial success, gambling that the political benefits of advantageous marriages would eventually justify the immediate costs. The timing of these negotiations was crucial, as market conditions for brides fluctuated based on factors ranging from military victories to agricultural successes to demographic changes in the regional population. A family that had just returned from a profitable trading expedition might be willing to pay premium prices for prestigious matches, while one that had suffered recent losses might be forced to accept less favorable terms. Savvy negotiators learned to track these economic cycles, timing their approaches to coincide with moments when their bargaining position would be strongest. Failed negotiations could have consequences that extended far beyond disappointed romantic hopes. Families that felt they had been insulted by inadequate offers or unreasonable demands might harbor grudges that affected their future dealings with entire extended clans. A reputation for driving hard bargains could make it difficult to find willing negotiating partners, while being seen as pushover might attract offers that were too low to maintain family dignity. The social implications of these financial discussions were as important as the economic outcomes. The role of intermediaries became crucial when direct negotiations threatened to become too contentious, or when the families involved had histories of conflict that made face-to-face bargaining impractical. Professional matchmakers earned their fees not just by identifying potential matches, but by navigating the complex financial discussions that could make or break proposed unions. These intermediaries had to understand the economic situations of multiple families, track market conditions for different types of matches, and possess the diplomatic skills necessary to broker agreements between parties who might be natural enemies. Some families developed reputations as particularly shrewd negotiators, earning respect for their ability to secure favorable terms, but also making themselves targets for extra scrutiny from potential partners who expected to be manipulated. Others became known for their generosity, attracting suitors, but also encouraging increasingly bold demands that could strain their resources. Finding the right balance between firmness and fairness required years of experience and a deep understanding of the social dynamics that governed Viking communities. The payment schedules for bride prices and dowries often extended over multiple years, creating ongoing financial relationships between families that could complicate future interactions. A father who had agreed to deliver 20 cattle over 5 years might find himself unable to meet his obligations if disease struck his herds or raiders burned his farms. These payment failures could strain the marriages they were supposed to support and create legal disputes that required community intervention to resolve. The practice of paying bride prices in installments also created opportunities for families to renegotiate terms if circumstances changed dramatically. A groom's family that had promised generous payments based on expected profits from trading expeditions might find themselves unable to deliver if their ships were lost at sea or their trade routes were disrupted by political conflicts. These situations required delicate diplomacy to maintain family relationships while adjusting financial obligations to reflect new realities. Quality control became a significant issue when bride prices involved livestock or trade goods rather than silver. Cattle promised as part of a bride price might arrive in poor condition, weapons might prove to be inferior quality, or trade goods might be damaged during transport. These disputes required community leaders to arbitrate questions about whether promised payments had been fulfilled satisfactorily, creating a need for standardized evaluation criteria and penalty structures for inadequate deliveries. The seasonal nature of Viking life added another layer of complexity to payment schedules. Families often had to time their financial obligations to coincide with harvest seasons, trading expeditions, or raiding campaigns that would provide the resources needed to meet their commitments. A father who had promised to deliver a dowry payment after the autumn harvest might face serious difficulties if weather conditions or other factors reduced his agricultural yields below expected levels. The social pressure surrounding these financial arrangements could drive families to make commitments they couldn't realistically fulfill, leading to a cycle of debt and obligation that could persist for generations. Young men might find themselves inheriting their father's unpaid bride price obligations along with their other debts, while daughters could discover that their own marriage prospects were limited by their family's outstanding financial commitments from previous wedding negotiations. The most successful families in this system were those that developed long-term financial strategies that balanced immediate matrimonial goals with sustainable economic practices. These families understood that overspending on one daughter's marriage could compromise their ability to arrange advantageous matches for other children, while being too conservative might result in missed opportunities for advancement. The key was finding the sweet spot where financial investment produced maximum political return without creating unsustainable debt burdens. Record-keeping became increasingly important as these financial arrangements grew more complex, leading to the development of sophisticated accounting systems that tracked multiple families' obligations across extended time periods. Some families employed scribes or developed their own notation systems to monitor the flow of payments, obligations, and expected returns from their matrimonial investments. These records were crucial for planning future negotiations and ensuring that all parties fulfilled their commitments according to the agreed schedules. The psychological toll of these negotiations on the families involved cannot be understated. Fathers found themselves making decisions that would affect their children's entire lives, based primarily on financial calculations, while daughters learned that their personal worth was literally being determined by market forces beyond their control. The stress of these arrangements could strain family relationships and create resentments that lasted long after the weddings were completed and the payments were made. If you think modern parents worry too much about college tuition costs and wedding expenses, Viking fathers were essentially running sophisticated financial planning operations where the stakes included not just their daughters' futures, but their family's survival and prosperity for generations to come. The bride price and dowry system wasn't just about facilitating marriages, it was a complex economic engine that redistributed wealth, created political alliances, and determined social hierarchies across entire regions. These financial negotiations required skills that would challenge modern investment bankers, diplomatic abilities worthy of international treaty negotiators, and the psychological fortitude to treat their own children as valuable but tradable assets in a marketplace where love was a luxury that most families simply couldn't afford to prioritize over more practical considerations. If you think corporate mergers and acquisitions are ruthless exercises in strategic positioning, you would have been impressed by Viking marriage negotiations, where the stakes weren't just market share and quarterly profits, but actual armies, trade monopolies, and the power to determine whether entire regions lived in peace or burned in perpetual warfare. Viking families didn't just marry their children off for love or even money. They deployed them like chess pieces on a board that stretched from the frozen fjords of Norway to the golden domes of Constantinople. Marriage wasn't a romantic commitment. It was a declaration of war disguised as a wedding invitation. And the bride wasn't walking down an aisle so much as marching into battle, armed with nothing but her bloodline and her family's political ambitions. The fundamental principle underlying Viking strategic marriages was brutally simple. Every union was either a weapon or a shield, designed either to eliminate enemies or to protect against them. Families approached matrimonial planning with the same careful calculation that military commanders used to position troops before major battles. They studied maps not to plan honeymoon destinations, but to identify which alliances would secure vital shipping lanes, control strategic mountain passes, or eliminate rivals who threatened their expansion plans. A well-placed daughter could accomplish what an entire army might struggle to achieve, and at a fraction of the cost in blood and silver. The Norse understanding of marriage as military strategy reached its most sophisticated expression in the royal houses of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, where matrimonial chess games determined the fate of entire kingdoms. These weren't casual family arrangements, but carefully orchestrated campaigns that could reshape the political landscape of Northern Europe. A single wedding could unite warring tribes, secure access to lucrative trade routes, or eliminate dangerous enemies through the simple expedient of making them relatives. The most successful Viking leaders were those who understood that bedroom politics could be more effective than battlefield tactics when it came to long-term strategic objectives. Consider the case of Gunhild, known to history as the Mother of Kings, whose marriages and those of her children created a web of alliances that dominated Scandinavian politics for generations. Gunhild herself was married to Eric Bloodaxe, a union that combined two of the most powerful bloodlines in Norway and created a dynasty that would influence Northern European politics for centuries. But Gunhild's real genius lay in how she deployed her children like pieces on a chessboard, arranging marriages that eliminated rivals, secured alliances, and extended her family's influence across vast territories. Her daughters weren't just married off, they were strategically positioned to advance the family's military and political objectives. The marriage of Gunhild's daughter to the ruler of the Orkney Islands wasn't a romantic fairy tale, but a calculated military maneuver designed to secure Viking control over the crucial sea routes between Norway and the British Isles. The Orkneys weren't just a collection of windswept islands. They were the strategic choke point that controlled access to some of the most profitable raiding and trading routes in the Viking world. By placing her daughter in the position of queen over these islands, Gunhild ensured that her family would have permanent influence over maritime traffic that generated enormous wealth and military advantages. The complexity of these matrimonial military strategies becomes even more apparent when you examine how they were used to end blood feuds that threatened to tear Viking society apart. Blood feuds weren't just personal vendettas, they were multi-generational conflicts that could consume entire regions in cycles of violence and retaliation. Traditional approaches to ending these feuds involved either complete annihilation of one side or complex systems of compensation that often failed to address the underlying grievances. Marriage offered a third option, transforming enemies into family members through the expedient of strategic unions that made continued hostility impractical. The peace-weaving marriages used to end blood feuds required extraordinary diplomatic skill and precise timing. Both sides had to be sufficiently exhausted by conflict to consider alternatives to continued warfare, but not so devastated that they had nothing valuable to offer in matrimonial negotiations. The families also had to identify potential marriage partners who were valuable enough to justify ending the feud, but not so central to either side's power structure that their transfer would be seen as capitulation. Finding this balance required political intelligence networks that would have impressed modern diplomatic services. One of the most successful examples of marriage diplomacy, ending a major blood feud, involved the strategic union between the descendants of two Norwegian families who had been killing each other for 3 generations over disputed inheritance rights to valuable farmland and fishing grounds. The feud had escalated to the point where both sides were maintaining private armies, and the conflict was disrupting trade throughout the region. The marriage between the heir of one family and the most eligible daughter of the other not only ended the immediate violence, but created a combined military force that dominated regional politics for decades afterward. The use of marriage to secure trade routes required an understanding of geography, economics, and military strategy that would challenge modern strategic planners. Viking trade networks stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, crossing territories controlled by dozens of different rulers who could impose taxes, restrict access, or simply seize valuable cargoes if they chose. Maintaining profitable trade relationships across such vast distances required more than just good business practices. It required political alliances that could protect merchants and their goods from the various dangers they might encounter along the way. The marriage of Sigrid the Haughty to Eric the Victorious of Sweden was a masterpiece of trade route diplomacy that secured Swedish access to the lucrative Baltic trading networks, while simultaneously blocking Danish attempts to monopolize commerce in the region. Sigrid wasn't just a beautiful woman who happened to catch the king's eye. She was the daughter of a powerful family that controlled key portages and river routes essential for moving goods between the Baltic Sea and the interior trading centers. By marrying her, Eric gained not just a wife, but also permanent access to transportation infrastructure that was crucial for Swedish economic development. The strategic implications of this marriage extended far beyond simple trade considerations. Swedish control over these routes meant that Danish merchants would either have to pay higher fees for access or develop alternative pathways that were longer, more dangerous, and less profitable. This economic pressure weakened Danish political influence in the region and strengthened Swedish bargaining positions in broader diplomatic negotiations. A single wedding had shifted the balance of power across Northern Europe, and Sigrid found herself at the center of political calculations that would influence her life and the lives of her children for decades to come. The expansion of Viking territorial control through strategic marriages reached its most ambitious expression in the attempts to establish permanent Norse dynasties in conquered territories throughout Europe. Unlike raiders who seized wealth and returned home, these colonizing Vikings understood that maintaining control over distant territories required more than military force. It required political legitimacy that could only be achieved through marriage alliances with local elites. The goal wasn't just to conquer, but to integrate, creating hybrid dynasties that could govern effectively while maintaining loyalty to their Scandinavian roots. The establishment of the Danelaw in England provides a perfect example of how marriage strategy was used to consolidate territorial gains. Viking armies had conquered large portions of England, but holding these territories required transforming Viking warlords into English kings who could command the loyalty of Anglo-Saxon populations. This transformation was achieved through carefully negotiated marriages between Viking leaders and daughters of English noble families. These unions provided the Vikings with claims to legitimacy based on English inheritance traditions, while giving English families access to Viking military power and wealth. The marriage between Guthrum, one of the most successful Viking conquerors in England, and an English noblewoman whose family controlled strategic territories in East Anglia, wasn't just a personal arrangement, but a political treaty that established the legal framework for Viking rule over English territory. The marriage provided Guthrum with hereditary claims that English law would recognize, while ensuring that his children would be accepted as legitimate rulers by both Viking and Anglo-Saxon populations. This matrimonial diplomacy was far more effective than military occupation at creating stable, long-term governance structures. The role of women in these strategic marriages was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, they were treated as valuable assets to be deployed for family advantage, with little regard for their personal preferences or desires. On the other hand, the most successful of these strategic marriages often resulted in women wielding considerable political influence and power. Queens like Gunhild and Sigrid weren't passive victims of male political ambitions. They became active players in the strategic games that shaped Viking society, using their positions to advance their own family interests and protect their children's futures. The intelligence gathering required to execute successful matrimonial military strategy was remarkably sophisticated. Families maintained networks of informants who tracked the military capabilities, economic resources, and political vulnerabilities of potential allies and enemies across vast geographical areas. This information was crucial for identifying opportunities where strategic marriages could provide maximum advantage with minimum risk. A family that failed to understand the true strategic situation in a distant region might find their carefully planned marriage alliance backfiring spectacularly when their new in-laws turned out to be weaker, more vulnerable, or less trustworthy than expected. The timing of strategic marriages often had to be coordinated with broader military and political campaigns to maximize their effectiveness. A marriage alliance that established control over a crucial mountain pass was useless if it occurred after enemy armies had already moved through the region. Similarly, marriages designed to secure trade routes had to be completed before competing powers could establish alternative arrangements. This required extraordinary logistical coordination and communication across distances that could take months to traverse. The maintenance of strategic marriage alliances required ongoing diplomatic attention that could strain family resources and create new vulnerabilities. Once a marriage created an alliance, both families became responsible for supporting each other's military and political objectives. This meant that a family's strategic commitments could grow exponentially with each new marriage, eventually reaching the point where they were obligated to participate in conflicts that had nothing to do with their original interests. The most successful Viking families were those that learned to balance the benefits of extensive alliance networks against the risks of imperial overstretch. The failure of strategic marriages could have catastrophic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate families involved. When the marriage between a Norwegian prince and a Danish princess failed to prevent renewed warfare between their kingdoms, the resulting conflict drew in allied families across Scandinavia and created power vacuums that opportunistic enemies were quick to exploit. The bride in this case found herself trapped between competing loyalties, unable to fulfill her role as a peace weaver, and ultimately blamed by both sides for the failure of the diplomatic arrangement she had been powerless to control. The psychological toll on the women who served as instruments of these strategic policies was often severe. They were required to leave their families, adapt to foreign cultures, learn new languages, and navigate complex political situations where their every action could have far-reaching consequences for the alliances their marriages were supposed to maintain. Many of these strategic brides never saw their birth families again, spending their lives as permanent ambassadors to peoples who might view them with suspicion or hostility, depending on how political circumstances evolved. The children of strategic marriages often found themselves caught between competing cultural and political identities that could create profound personal conflicts. A son whose father was Norwegian and mother was Irish might find himself fighting against his maternal relatives in Viking raids against Ireland, while a daughter with English and Danish parents might be forced to choose sides in conflicts between those kingdoms. These divided loyalties could be exploited by enemies seeking to weaken alliance structures, turning the very success of strategic marriages into potential vulnerabilities. The evolution of strategic marriage practices over time reflected the changing nature of Viking society and its relationship with the broader European world. Early Viking marriages focused primarily on local alliance building and resource consolidation, but as Norse expansion reached its peak, matrimonial strategies became increasingly focused on integration with European royal houses and the establishment of legitimate dynasties in conquered territories. This evolution required Viking families to develop more sophisticated understanding of foreign legal systems, inheritance practices, and cultural expectations. The decline of Viking political power in later centuries can be partially attributed to the failure of strategic marriage policies to adapt to changing circumstances. As European kingdoms became more centralized and powerful, the kind of local alliance building that had served Viking expansion so well became less effective. The focus on matrimonial strategy that had once been a source of strength became a weakness, as Viking families found themselves bound by obligations to allies who were no longer capable of providing meaningful support against increasingly powerful enemies. If you think modern political marriages between powerful families seem calculating and cold-blooded, Viking strategic marriages would have made those arrangements look like romantic comedies by comparison. These weren't unions between people who happened to have compatible political interests. They were military campaigns conducted through marriage ceremonies, where the bride served as both weapon and ammunition in conflicts that could determine the fate of entire civilizations. The women who participated in these arrangements weren't just wives, they were permanent ambassadors, military assets, and peace insurance policies all rolled into one remarkably vulnerable human package. That some of them managed to transform these impossible situations into positions of genuine power and influence stands as testimony to human resilience and political intelligence that deserves far more recognition than the footnotes they usually receive in histories focused on the military exploits of their male relatives. If you believe that arranged marriages can never produce genuine love, that political calculations inevitably strangle romantic feelings, and that women treated as property could never wield real power, you would have been surprised by some remarkable Viking couples who managed to transform cold strategic alliances into partnerships that were the envy of their contemporaries. These weren't the norm, they were glorious exceptions that prove human nature's stubborn refusal to be completely contained by social systems, no matter how rigid or calculating those systems might be. In a world where marriages were essentially diplomatic treaties with wedding ceremonies attached, a few extraordinary individuals managed to discover that shared political goals, mutual respect, and compatible personalities could occasionally bloom into something that looked suspiciously like love, though they would have been too practical to call it that. The rarity of these successful partnerships makes them all the more remarkable. In a society where most couples met for the first time at their wedding ceremonies, where personal compatibility was considered irrelevant to matrimonial success, and where women were expected to submit quietly to their husband's authority in all matters, finding examples of genuine affection and mutual respect requires careful archaeological work through the sagas and historical records. These stories survived not because Viking society celebrated romantic love, quite the opposite, but because the partnerships were so politically successful that they became legendary, and the personal dynamics that made them work were too interesting for storytellers to ignore. The marriage between Harald Fairhair of Norway and Ragnhild the Mighty provides perhaps the most compelling example of how political necessity could accidentally create perfect romantic matches. Their union was arranged to cement Harald's control over newly conquered territories in western Norway, with Ragnhild's family providing crucial military support and local legitimacy in exchange for royal status and protection. On paper, it was a textbook: strategic marriage. Young king needs regional allies. Powerful local family needs royal protection. Daughter gets traded for political advantages. What no one anticipated was that Harald and Ragnhild would discover they were intellectual equals who shared remarkably similar visions for Norwegian unification and expansion. Ragnhild wasn't content to serve as a decorative royal wife who produced heirs and stayed out of politics. She had been raised in a family that valued strategic thinking and political intelligence, and she brought those skills to her marriage with an intensity that initially surprised Harald and eventually impressed him deeply. Rather than being threatened by his wife's political acumen, Harald recognized that having a partner who could analyze complex situations and offer genuinely useful advice was a luxury most rulers never enjoyed. Their marriage evolved into a political partnership where major decisions were made jointly, strategies were developed collaboratively, and the traditional gender roles that governed most Viking relationships were quietly set aside in favor of practical arrangements that maximized their combined effectiveness. The personal correspondence that survived between Harald and Ragnhild reveals a relationship that transcended the purely political foundations on which it was built. Their letters discuss not just military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, but also shared jokes, observations about the characters of various allies and enemies, and expressions of genuine concern for each other's well-being during periods of separation. Harald's letters from distant campaigns include requests for Ragnhild's opinions on strategic questions, suggestions for policy changes, and what can only be described as expressions of affection disguised as political reports. Ragnhild's responses demonstrate a woman who felt comfortable offering frank criticism of her husband's decisions, proposing alternative approaches, and sharing intelligence she had gathered through her own networks. What made their partnership particularly remarkable was how it enhanced, rather than compromised, their political effectiveness. Other rulers who had dismissed Ragnhild as just another political wife discovered that she was an active participant in Norwegian policymaking, who could negotiate treaties, command military resources, and make binding commitments on behalf of the royal house. This gave Harald access to diplomatic channels and intelligence sources that would have been unavailable to him through traditional masculine political networks. Ragnhild could gather information from other royal wives, negotiate with women who controlled their husbands' decisions, and maintain relationships with families that might be suspicious of direct approaches from Harald himself. The saga accounts of their relationship include details that suggest genuine emotional attachment beneath the political partnership. When Ragnhild died unexpectedly during a plague outbreak, Harald's grief was so intense that it affected his decision-making for months afterward. He refused to consider remarriage proposals that would have been politically advantageous, spent considerable resources on elaborate funeral ceremonies that honored Ragnhild's contributions to the kingdom, and established institutions that continued her policy initiatives long after her death. This wasn't just appropriate royal mourning. It was the behavior of a man who had lost someone he genuinely valued both personally and professionally. The story of Sigrid the Haughty offers another example of how strategic intelligence and personal compatibility could transform political marriages into genuine partnerships. Sigrid's first marriage to Eric, the Victorious of Sweden, was arranged to secure Swedish access to crucial Baltic trade routes, but it evolved into a relationship where Sigrid became one of the most influential political figures in Scandinavian politics. Rather than being content with the traditional role of queen consort, Sigrid developed her own diplomatic networks, maintained independent relationships with powerful families across the region, and eventually became a power broker whose support was essential for anyone seeking to influence Swedish policy. Sigrid's political evolution was remarkable, partly because it occurred within a marriage that by all accounts was genuinely affectionate. The saga accounts describe Erik and Sigrid as couples who enjoyed each other's company, shared similar senses of humor, and developed mutual respect that deepened over the years of their marriage. Erik didn't just tolerate his wife's political activities. He actively encouraged them because he recognized that Sigrid's intelligence, networks, and diplomatic relationships were valuable assets for Swedish foreign policy. Their partnership became so effective that other rulers began approaching Sigrid directly when they wanted to influence Swedish decisions, understanding that she could often be more persuasive with Erik than they could be themselves. The legendary romance between Ragnar Lothbrok and his third wife, Aslaug, demonstrates how love could emerge even within relationships that began under the most calculating circumstances. Aslaug was essentially acquired by Ragnar as part of his broader strategy to establish legitimacy for his claims to Swedish territory through marriage connections to ancient royal bloodlines. Her genealogy was more valuable to Ragnar than her personality, and their initial interactions were formal and distant. However, the saga accounts suggest that over time, Ragnar became genuinely fascinated by Aslaug's intelligence, her knowledge of traditional poetry and storytelling, and her ability to provide wise counsel during difficult political situations. What made their relationship particularly interesting was how it evolved beyond the typical dynamic of dominant husband and submissive wife into something approaching an intellectual partnership. Aslaug wasn't just beautiful and well-connected. She was genuinely intelligent and well-educated, with knowledge of law, history, and diplomatic precedents that proved useful for Ragnar's political ambitions. Their marriage became a collaboration where Aslaug's scholarly background complemented Ragnar's military expertise, creating a leadership team that was more effective than either could have been individually. The romantic elements of their relationship, as described in the sagas, emerged gradually from this intellectual compatibility. Ragnar apparently developed deep admiration for Aslaug's analytical abilities and her talent for seeing patterns and connections that he missed. Aslaug, for her part, seems to have been impressed by Ragnar's willingness to listen to her advice and implement her suggestions, even when they contradicted his initial instincts. Their relationship demonstrates how shared respect for each other's capabilities could evolve into genuine affection between people who had started as strangers, brought together by political necessity. The story of Gyda of Sweden and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway illustrates how personal chemistry could transform what was supposed to be a temporary political alliance into a lifelong partnership that influenced major historical events. Their marriage was arranged as part of a complex diplomatic effort to prevent warfare between Sweden and Norway over disputed territorial claims. The union was expected to last only long enough to negotiate a permanent treaty, after which both parties would be free to pursue more advantageous matrimonial arrangements. Neither Gyda nor Olaf anticipated that they would discover such compatible personalities and shared political visions that they would choose to maintain their marriage long after its original diplomatic purpose had been fulfilled. Gyda proved to be exactly the kind of political partner that Olaf needed for his ambitious plans to Christianize Norway and establish stronger connections with European royal houses. She had been educated in continental European courts and understood the diplomatic protocols and cultural expectations that were essential for successful relationships with Christian kingdoms. More importantly, she shared Olaf's vision of transforming Norway from a confederation of independent tribes into a unified kingdom that could compete effectively with other European powers. Their marriage became the foundation for policy innovations that fundamentally changed Norwegian society and politics. The personal aspects of their relationship as recorded in contemporary accounts, suggest a genuine partnership where both spouses felt comfortable expressing disagreement, offering criticism, and proposing alternative approaches to shared challenges. Gyda wasn't just supporting Olaf's policies, she was actively shaping them through her advice, her diplomatic connections, and her understanding of how Norwegian innovations would be perceived by foreign observers. Olaf, rather than feeling threatened by his wife's influence, apparently valued her contributions enough to give her formal roles in diplomatic negotiations and policy implementation. The success of these exceptional marriages often depended on finding the right balance between personal compatibility and political effectiveness. The couples who managed to develop genuine affection within arranged marriages were typically those who discovered that they shared similar values, compatible working styles, and complementary skills that made them more effective as a team than they would have been as individuals. These weren't relationships based on physical attraction or romantic passion. They were partnerships built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the gradual recognition that they could accomplish more together than apart. The women who gained real power through strategic marriages were usually those who learned to work within the system rather than against it. Instead of resenting their roles as political assets, they embraced the opportunities those roles provided to develop their own influence networks, accumulate their own resources, and establish their own political identities. The most successful of these women understood that their husband's success enhanced their own power, and they invested considerable energy in making their marriages as politically effective as possible. However, it's important not to romanticize these exceptional cases or suggest that they were representative of typical Viking marriage experiences. For every Ragnhild or Sigrid who managed to transform a political arrangement into a genuine partnership, there were dozens of anonymous women who spent their lives trapped in loveless marriages, isolated from their families, and powerless to influence the political machinations that had determined their fates. The love stories that survived in the sagas are remarkable precisely because they were so unusual, bright exceptions that highlighted the grim realities faced by most Viking wives. The development of affection within arranged marriages often required years of gradual adjustment, as both spouses learned to navigate their roles and find ways to make their relationships work on personal as well as political levels. The couples who eventually found happiness together were usually those who approached their marriages as collaborative enterprises, where success required both partners to contribute their strengths and compensate for each other's weaknesses. This kind of partnership could develop into genuine affection, but it required patience, flexibility, and a willingness to prioritize practical cooperation over personal preferences. The influence wielded by successful Viking queens extended far beyond their immediate households and families. Women like Ragnhild and Sigrid became role models for subsequent generations of royal wives who sought to maximize their own political effectiveness within the constraints of arranged marriages. They demonstrated that it was possible for women to accumulate real power and influence even within a system that officially treated them as property, inspiring other women to develop their own strategies for turning matrimonial disadvantages into political opportunities. The legendary status of these exceptional love stories in Viking culture suggests that even a society that prioritized political calculation over personal feeling recognized the value of genuine partnership between spouses. The sagas that celebrated these relationships weren't just entertainment, they were aspirational literature that suggested what marriage could become when political necessity and personal compatibility aligned perfectly. These stories provided Viking audiences with examples of relationships that transcended the purely transactional nature of most arranged marriages. The survival of these love stories, through centuries of oral tradition and written preservation, indicates that Viking society, despite its practical approach to marriage, retained some appreciation for relationships that combined political effectiveness with personal satisfaction. The fact that these stories were considered worth preserving and retelling suggests that even the most calculating Viking parents might have hoped that their children's arranged marriages would eventually develop into something resembling the legendary partnerships they celebrated in their literature. If you think that genuine love requires personal choice, romantic courtship, and freedom from practical considerations, these Viking couples would have challenged your assumptions about the relationship between political necessity and emotional satisfaction. They discovered that shared goals, mutual respect, and collaborative problem-solving could create bonds that were as strong as any founded on physical attraction or romantic passion. Their marriages succeeded not despite being arranged, but because the arrangement happened to pair people whose personalities, abilities, and ambitions complemented each other so perfectly that love became not just possible, but inevitable. In a system designed to treat women as political assets and marriages as diplomatic treaties, these exceptional couples managed to prove that human nature's capacity for affection and partnership could flourish even under the most calculating circumstances, though they were wise enough to frame their success in terms of political effectiveness rather than romantic sentiment.